So, I mean, we read Gerald Dworkin's America, and I thought he was
That's true.
clear enough. Holmes, fairly clear. Austin, extremely clear. Aquinas, not at all clear. But yeah, I mean, Hart is a wonderful example of a extremely clear and at the same time penetrating writer, seems to me. Anyway, okay. Have we got more in the room yet? Did we pick up any bodies? Oh yeah, full house. Well, anyway, like 10 people. All right, let's get back to Hart on Devlin. Just to recall where we are, the question here is whether it is ever justified to prohibit or regulate conduct that harms nobody, including the people who engage in the behavior, but which is regarded as immoral. So is it ever permissible to legislate against immorality as such? And what we're leaving, what's not on the table is any sort of argument to the effect that, well, of course it's justified because the action is immoral. What we need is to find some further good to be attained or evil to be avoided by the prohibition or regulation of immoral action, beyond just the incidence of the immoral action. And the context here is provided by the Wolfenden Committee's recommended prohibition on, or rather eliminating prohibitions on prostitution and homosexuality. Prohibition, the regulation or prohibition of prostitution was enacted, but not that of homosexuality. And Devlin criticized the recommendation and, of course, the, in fact, decriminalization of prostitution, claiming that the reason to regulate vice is the same as the reason to regulate subversive activities. That is, they are subversive of society. Vice itself is subversive of society. So positive morality ought to be enforced because it's permissible for a society to do what makes the regulation of subversive activity permissible, namely preserve its own existence as an organized society. So that is the line of argument that Hart is going to consider and reject. So now let me bring your work. Okay. So first thing we have to do is to make clear the distinction between positive and critical morality. Okay. Positive morality is the morality whose enforcement is in question. Okay? We're asking whether positive morality should be enforced. But it would be useless to argue that the positive morality of a society should be enforced because that's what the positive morality of society says. That would be circular, right? We should enforce positive morality because our positive morality says to enforce positive morality. That's just blatantly circular. What we need, then, is another kind of morality against which to judge the question whether positive morality should be enforced, and Hart calls that critical morality. Okay? So critical morality is the standpoint from which we're going to assess the question whether positive morality should be enforced. So what Devlin needs to provide to justify the enforcement of positive morality is a principle of critical morality that justifies it. Okay? And his claim then that society can do what is necessary to preserve its own existence must be being offered not as a principle of positive morality. If it were offered that way, it would be circular, but as a principle of critical morality. Right? And so that's how it's got to be assessed. And what he's doing, what Hart is doing here is saying, look, it's entirely possible that it's part of our critical morality, of our positive morality, that people actually believe, right, and think it's important and value, treat it as a moral principle, that our society has a right to protect itself no matter what. Right? That may be something that people believe as a matter of positive morality, and think positive morality here in the Austinian sense, right? What Hart is saying is that view doesn't matter for these purposes. What matters is whether it is a principle of critical morality that, right, from a stance that can possibly reject aspects of positive morality as misguided or unjustified, right? It's a principle of critical morality we need. So Devlin's claim that societies have a right to protect themselves has to be taken as a principle of critical morality and assessed as such, not just for whether it conforms with positive morality. Yeah, Sam.
So critical morality, for this Devlin's principle context, would exist in like other than like societies taking.
It has to, because if all it is a principle of positive morality, then his justification is circular.
So what is society's relation to critical?
Well, that's up for grabs. It may be, it depends on what critical morality we accept. Mill accepted utilitarianism as critical morality. It certainly wasn't the positive morality of his day. Kantians will accept Kantian arguments about the dignity of persons and the worth of persons as such, and right as their critical morality. Aristotelians will take virtue theory as their critical morality. Right? So what we need is a principle of critical morality, or else the whole discussion is pointless because circular. So we're going to take Devlin's claim as a principle of critical morality and then ask, okay, is that true as a matter of critical morality? And Hart, right, so the point is that's how it's got to be addressed. It won't do to just ask whether, in fact, people think it's true. Right? You'll have to defend it as a principle of critical morality. Okay. Second thing to note is this is a matter of justification. And one might say, well, why is any justification required? And the answer is that punishment of offenders of laws, which is what you get when you prohibit behavior, that anybody who engages in that behavior is subject to punishment, that's a great harm to those people. Right? That's a great harm. And the infliction of harm has to be justified. You don't get just to inflict harm for no reason. So the reason that it's a harm and requires justification, the reason might be many. Liberty is a value in itself. Right? So people want to have that liberty, or we need experiments in living. So there's use to the fact that people have the rights to engage in these things. But Hart doesn't emphasize that kind of harm. He emphasizes the fact that those whose liberty to act as they please is constrained, they feel a very unpleasant and enduring frustration. He says, a quite special degree of misery, especially when the proscribed action is sexual in nature. Says the suppression of sexual impulses is both difficult and has serious consequences for the emotional life, happiness, and personality of people whose sexual impulses are suppressed, in a way that suppression of desires to commit ordinary crimes, like theft and assault, typically do not. Right? So maybe you desire to commit a crime, but if I prohibit you from committing a crime, I'm limiting your liberty, okay, but you were going to harm someone. Right? But the harm I'm doing to you in limiting your liberty there, right, by suppressing your thievery tendencies, is unlikely to cause you severe psychological damage, which will result or can result from limiting people's ability to act on their sexual impulses. I might mention here that Hart was a homosexual whose conduct was illegal through much of his adult life. He was also married, but never mind that. But he was in a situation much like Alan Turing, the famous mathematician who was destroyed by undergoing, conversion therapy, etc. And if his actions had been illegal, right, he probably wouldn't have had to do that, right? So that's the sort of channel that Hart is swimming in here. Okay. So anyway, the distinction between critical and positive morality can be used to clarify the current form of the debate. Mill had it as a critical principle that law should maximize utility. And it didn't matter to him whether the current positive morality said law should maximize utility. Devlin's view is that the law should enforce the current positive morality, but this is itself a critical moral point, and it may or may not conform with positive morality. But the utilitarian and Devlin's critical moral principles conflict. The question is whether, right, so Mill certainly disagreed that people's private conduct should be regulated simply because of its conflict with positive morality. That the harm principle says absolutely no, you cannot do that. So Mill's positive or critical morality says you can't do that. Devlin says you should do that. You can and should do that. So the question is whether Devlin's principle is sound. Is the moral principle that law should be used to enforce current positive morality a legitimate principle? And Hart is going to say no. Whoops, I didn't mean to. Okay, the use and abuse of examples. There are, and certainly were, instances of laws that prohibit behavior simply because they violate public morality, though they harm no one other than the agent. Okay, so maybe one example of this might be incest between consenting adults. Okay. However, some sorts of cases are thought to be like this that are not. So, for example, suicide. You might think that rules prohibiting suicide are, right, suicide is just immoral and that's why it can be prohibited. No, suicide involves a harm to someone, namely the person doing it, and others as well, but the person doing it primarily, and Hart thinks you can regulate harms. But the problem is that Devlin gives various examples of sorts of laws that we all accept as legitimate as evidence that we all accept that morality should be enforced. But they don't count as that, right, necessarily. So, for example, laws against also the law, the rule that we don't allow consent as a defense against certain crimes. We don't allow consent as a defense against murder or assault. Even if you say, go ahead, hit me upside the head with a 2x4, you have my permission, I'm still not allowed to do it. Even if you say, kill me, please, I'm still not allowed to do it. And Devlin takes that as evidence that, well, since the person was consenting to it, no one was harmed, and so the only reason that we prohibit acts like that, even with consent, is that they're immoral. Hart says, no. He says, the situation is that these are paternalistic laws. These are laws that are designed to protect people from harming themselves. That's paternalism. Paternalism is not what's in question here. What's in question is that paternalism involves doing things to keep people from harming themselves. The question here is, are we allowed to keep people from doing things which harm nobody, but which violate positive morality? So these examples that Devlin gives are inapposite, as a lawyer would say. They don't, right? They're not to the point of the case. Right, and here Hart remarks at length at the inadequacies of Mill's arguments against paternalism, too dependent on dubious empirical assumptions. I believe this is where you find the quote about Mill had, too much in mind the image of the Victorian man of, middle age and settled taste, et cetera, who knows his own mind, right? Okay. So what we would require from Devlin as an example of a law to enforce morals is one that prevents behavior that is contrary to public morality but doesn't harm anyone. And he simply hasn't come up with an unambiguous instance of that. So it isn't even clear that it is a matter of that people accept the offered principle. Well, it isn't clear that people accept that morality should be enforced for its own sake. That's not clear. Not that it would matter if it were, because we need to take it as a critical principle, but it isn't even clearly a principle of positive morality. Just as an aside, given that what we need is an example of a law that prevents actions that are thought immoral but that harm no one, you can ask whether there is ever any such thing as a behavior that is thought immoral but is not a harm to anyone. Being offended, however ephemeral a harm it is a harm. And simply knowing that people are engaged in what you think is immoral action can be offensive to some people. I just can't abide the fact that behind that door over there are two dudes kissing. That just creeps me out. The fact that might happen anywhere offends me. Say, I'm play acting there. That's not my voice. That is right. Imagining a character. Got to be real careful these days, right? But given that, isn't the mere fact of immoral behavior always, at least potentially, a harm to someone? So the point is just a very nitpicky, analytical point. Maybe there are no cases in which what we're talking about is clearly the regulation of morality for its own sake rather than to prevent harm. Easy to find diffuse, tiny harms. They're running around all over the place. Okay, that said, we need to distinguish between two theses here that are sort of this will help clarify the claim Devlin is making. There's a moderate thesis and an extreme thesis. The moderate thesis is that a shared morality is necessary to ensure the cohesion of a society, and that's what justifies the enforcement of morality. And this is what Devlin seems to intend. Okay. Right? You need to ensure a cohesive society that is distinct from an aggregate of people. Right? And that need is what justifies the enforcement of morality. And then there's an extreme thesis. Morality should be enforced simply so as to prevent immoral behavior. Now, both of these could be principles of critical morality. So, when evaluating a given behavior for whether it should be prohibited, we have to ask two questions. Does the behavior violate positive morality? Whoa, I put the same question up here. That's not what it should say. It should say, let me fix it, fixing it. Question one, does the behavior tend to harm society? Question two, does the behavior violate positive morality? The point is this, for a behavior to be legitimately prohibited, on the extreme thesis, all you need is a positive answer to question one. But for it to be legitimately prohibited on the moderate thesis, as understood as why you can prohibit behavior because it's immoral, you need a positive answer to both 1 and 2. Okay, if you have only a positive answer to 1, then it's no longer a case of prohibiting behavior because it's immoral. But to prohibit behavior on the moderate thesis because it's immoral, you need a positive answer to both 1 and 2. So it's got to both be violative of morality and tend to harm society. Stop it. Thank you. So Devlin argues on the basis of what appears to be just an assumption that immoral behavior does threaten society. Because he talks about the threat of society posed by immoral behaviors as why morality should be enforced. But he seems to take it as more or less of an a priori claim that immoral behavior poses a relevant threat, because he gives no concrete examples, save to say things of a vague and dubious sort, like history shows us that the first step to the degradation of society is a loosening of moral bonds. Does it really? Is that an unimpeachably clear evidence from the historical record? Well, no, of course it isn't. His idea appears to be that all of morality, sexual morality, also the immorality of murder, assault, theft, subversion, etc. All of morality is some sort of a seamless web, right? Such that a loosening of any aspect of that web loosens the whole thing. As if, and this is what it says in my notes, so I'll just read it, as if one little BJ among consenting adult males is a gateway to a killing spree. It says that in my notes because I wrote it, but I wanted to distance myself a little bit from it before I read it. Look, it's not true a priori, or a priori, depending upon how you say that phrase, right? That the loosening of moral bonds in one dimension necessarily loosens the whole thing. And there is no compelling evidence for it. As Hart says, it is as well supported as Justinian's claim that homosexuality is the cause of earthquakes. That is to say, it is not supported at all. So as far as evidence for the claim that a loosening of bonds of morality anywhere is threatens the degree of moral cohesion that is required for a stable society, there's no evidence of that. Yeah, Sam.
Devlin goes about like, he does something like defines society as right?
Yeah.
And if you define it like that, you maybe are more like you more have to say that if those bonds are like would you define society differently? How well does
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean that's vague. What's required? What constitutes common bonds? If what you mean is everybody holds and internalizes exactly the same moral opinions, then it's obviously way too strong for it to be a useful definition of society. Right? And as Hart's going to say, even so, that still could tolerate the idea of, well, I mean, it's just implausibly strong. So once you say, okay, there has to be some common morality, then the question arises, okay, well, which loosenings and where actually threaten the relevant degree of common morality? Now, but what you say is relevant to the next thing that that Hart says is that, look, Devlin seems to be maybe making another argument here, which is no less unconvincing, no more convincing, but it may be a little bit more interesting than this argument that, you know, evidence shows that any loosening of morality tends to the disruption of the society. And that's this, right? He has an assumption here. From the fact that he seems to have another assumption. From the fact that a society requires a roughly shared public morality in order to be distinguished from an aggregate, right? It follows that the shared morality of a society at any given time is essential to that, right, existence of that society. What I meant to say is, yeah, that morality of a society at any given time is essential to the existence of that society. Right? That is, right? He assumes that a change in a society's public morality constitutes its destruction. So whereas it may be true that a society needs a public shared morality, roughly shared public morality, to be distinguished from an aggregate in order not to constitute just an aggregate, that might be true. I'm not sure I think it's true, but the claim that any change in its morality constitutes its destruction, that's absurd. It would mean that we could never say that the morality of a society had changed. That just wouldn't make sense. What you would have to say is that every time there is any evolution of the moral public morality of a, right, there's no such thing as evolution of a public morality. There's just the repetitive destruction of societies being replaced by new societies at every moment. Right? If that were were true that a society has a right to defend itself from destruction, then it would follow that you could enforce the morality all the time because any change in it would be its destruction. Okay? But once you see that society's morality evolve and that a simple change is not a destruction, right away you see, well then, the fact that behavior is regarded as immoral and might lead to a change in the morality, that can't justify right, prohibiting the behavior. That is to say, that kind of destruction of society, which is now defined in terms of any alteration in its public morality, yeah, you don't have a right to be preserved from that kind of destruction. Gary.
I guess I'm having a little.
Of P2?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a, so what it is an apparent assumption which would make Devlin's argument valid, but unsound because that thing we add to make it valid is false. Right? So to get validly from P1 to C, you need to add P2. Devlin never articulates it, but given that he thinks this inference is valid, he must think P2 as well. But that's ridiculous.
Doesn't necessarily.
Well, but transforming something into another society is a destruction of the society that it was. Not, does that society exist anymore? No, it's another society now. Right. So I mean the big point here is it's really dicey to make criteria for the identity of a society through time or for its identity, right, to be tied up very tightly with any particular positive morality that it might be said to have at any given time. I mean, look at the United States. I mean, some people will say, well, you know, real reactionaries will say, well, that's right, we're not a society anymore because we don't all believe, you know, in God, guns, and whatever, right? But we never all believed the same things. I mean, this idea that there was some time where everyone in the society shared the same values is a joke. There was never any time like that. Now, Devlin might say, well, you know, or the reactionary might say, well, Devlin might say, well, you never were a genuine society, right? But that begins to look ridiculous, right? You're going to deny that, you know, anything other than like an Amish town is a society. So that's a ridiculous claim. And once you say, okay, things we know of as societies really are societies, things we think of societies through time really are societies, and look, they change their positive morality. So apparently, keeping the same positive morality through time is not required for the continuation of a society, and therefore, things that might happen that might change the positive morality of the society, right, aren't necessarily threats to the society. But it's Devlin's base argument that things that threaten the positive morality threaten the society itself. And that's why we can legitimately enforce morality even when no one is harmed. I guess that's the end. So, Hart concludes by offering some limitations here. He concludes with an explanation of the misconception that accepting democratic rule implies that majorities have absolute power, and therefore the power to enforce their morality. Fans of democracy should accept that the majority should rule, but not that they should rule absolutely. Right? If you like democracy, that doesn't mean that you therefore should accept that whatever the majority says goes. As Mill recognized, right? As he says, vox populi, the voice of the people, does not equate with vox Dei, with the voice of God, right? With authority about what's right and good. And that is especially likely in places that accept the idea that democratically elected officials are representatives rather than delegates of their constituencies. Because if they are representatives but not delegates, then what the representatives say do not necessarily reflect the voice even of the majority that elected them. So if you think of your legislator as your delegate, it is their job to represent to, as it were, embody your voice in the legislature. If you think of them as your representative, instead, it's their job to make decisions that they think is right, that they think are right, and then you can then, vote them out if you don't like them. But their job isn't to vote as you would have were you there. Anyone who accepts the question whether morality should be enforced as a legitimate question implicitly accepts the distinction between positive and critical morality, and therefore accepts the propriety of arguments for or against the critical morality that would be used to justify such enforcement. Hart has simply undermined the critical morality that suggests that morality should be enforced. Devlin has no good argument for that. Okay. Yes, Zaki, that's a good observation. Okay, yeah.
So on this note, I guess I'm starting to see why the P2 is a necessary assumption. Because could Devlin be saying something like a society requires a shared public morality? It doesn't seem like that shared public morality has to be has to have constant content.
Right.
Right?
It shouldn't. It certainly shouldn't.
Right. So the change in society's public morality doesn't threaten if the content of the public morality. But
right.
we still might say that the public morality is necessary for the society to exist. Right. So
that some public morality is necessary for the society to exist.
Yes.
But the only way to say that, therefore immoral conduct should be prohibited in defense of the existence of the society as opposed to an aggregate, you'd have to say that a change a change in public morality is necessarily a threat. But why would it be? Right? So you need P2 there to get from you need a shared public morality, right? And the claim societies have a right to defend themselves against destruction to morality should be enforced.
What if you say something like the shared public morality is, or like a shared public morality is made or is protected if that shared public morality is enforced. Like, is there any sense in which that might?
Well, that goes back to the first argument that you need to keep all the moral bonds, as it were, taut they're going to degrade into something that's no longer something tight enough to count as a society at all. So, yeah, I mean, the question is, for example, why make homosexuality illegal? Right? If, not making homosexuality illegal was going to lead to changes that would destroy the society, well, then that looks implausible. Then that's ridiculous. That's absurd. But if the further claim is made that, well, any change in morality constitutes destruction of the society, then the argument becomes valid, but obviously unsound, because that's obviously a false principle.
The issue is that changes in morality aren't always a threat.
Right.
To assume that at any level is probably.
Yeah, they're not always a threat to either the existence of a shared public morality. That's the first claim. And the second claim is they're certainly not a threat because they themselves, because any change in public morality itself would constitute a destruction. They're both bad arguments. This one clearly relies on a false assumption. The prior one relies on a completely unsupported, evidentially unsupported claim. But this on a sort of an absurd assumption. The assumption that that a loosening of bonds anywhere in public morality leads inevitably to a loosening everywhere, that's an empirical assumption that just doesn't seem to be borne out by evidence. But this assumption, a change in a society's public morality is the destruction of that society, that's absurd on its face. That's the difference. All right. We're never really going to be leaving the connection between law and morality, but we are now ready to shift focus to a more particular issue, and that is the justification of punishment. Let me get this sized right. Again, it's being troublesome, but we'll. So we're going to read 3 articles about punishment and its justification. Two of them adopt a retributivist justification, and the other one adopts a different account on which the purpose of punishment is restitution, so making the victim whole, as opposed to something like retributivism, which is a refined version of revenge of some sort. But before we head there, I want to discuss as a preliminary matter accounts of the justification of punishment that we're not going to cover directly, though they'll be brought up by implication in the readings. I used to assign Bentham on utilitarianism accounts of punishment, but it's terrifically, dreadfully dull read, and the point of it and its limitations can be summed up pretty clearly. So, as we've seen, as a preliminary matter, let's talk about the utilitarian or consequentialist justifications of punishment. So, as we've seen in connection with Mill's harm principle and with Austin as well, the classical utilitarians like Bentham and Austin and Mill were progressive reformers. For them, the key to reforming harsh, coercive political institutions was to limit the harms that they're allowed to inflict to those that are justified by producing some greater net happiness. So the only legitimate use of any coercive power, be it the state's or anybody else's, is to foster utility, promote the greater happiness. So for them, the sole justification for punishment, and now I'll put it in scare quotes, is the greater, and by the way, punishment is obviously the infliction of a harm. And the infliction of a harm has to be justified. You don't just get to do that, like, for no reason. Right? You have to have a justification. So for the utilitarians, the sole justification for punishment, and again in scare quotes, and for reasons that will be clear in a minute, is the greater net utility gained by the infliction of that harm. Inflicting that harm should have consequences that will outweigh the harm, good consequences, net good consequences, or net consequences that will outweigh the harm done by inflicting the punishment. Now, this supposed utility in harming people by punishing them, may take many forms. So specific deterrence, that person won't murder again, or general deterrence, right? If we put that person behind bars forever or execute them or whatever, that will serve as a deterrent to other people who are likely to murder. And we'll talk at a later date about whether there's any reason to think that there's any general deterrent effect to criminal law or to punishing people. But anyway, and how substantial that is. Just be it known that Bentham presents sort of sketches of how to think of these kinds of cost-benefit analyses involving punishment, including how severe should the punishment be? Right? It's in terms of, well, it should be it should offset the cost of incarceration. The benefit should offset the cost of incarceration, and they should be severe enough to disincentivize the behaviors to the point where you save more utility by disincentivizing the behaviors than you lose by incarcerating people. Anyway, it's all very complicated and technical, and it's all predicated on a view of punishment that has a fundamental problem. The biggest problem for utilitarian, or generally for consequentialist theories of punishment, is that they simply seem to violate principles of justice, which demand that a person be punished for wrongs that they have done. That is to say, that a key, if not the exclusive element in justifying punishment is that the person did something wrong for which they deserve punishment. And in a consequentialist view, what they did doesn't matter in itself. Utilitarian theory, or a consequentialist theory, generally takes the fact of criminal behavior not as a justification to punish that person, but as an excuse to use that person by inflicting harm on them in order to promote some further good. Right? So in this sense, utilitarian or consequentialist theories always are looking forward at the consequences of action. What do we do now? And the facts about the past are not essential to what to do now. Right? Not in the sense of justifying what we do now. They might be relevant in the sense of enabling us, being part of what helps us predict the consequences of what we do now, but never to justify what we do now. To say that was it, right? This action or this person deserves to be treated that way in light of what they did. It's just that, in light of what they did, we can see that it will be useful to treat them a certain way. And that seems fundamentally unjust. Right? So, for example, from the consequentialist standpoint, the fact that someone actually did commit the crime would make no difference if treating them as if they had committed the crime would have exactly the same consequences, whether they committed it or not. And that seems fundamentally unjust and fundamentally false to the whole idea of punishment. And Morris is going to make an argument which will sort of bring out this intuition, that to punish someone is to give them something that their behavior has shown they deserve. They deserve a certain kind of treatment. And the notion of deserving to be treated a certain way in the light of what you have done has absolutely no grip in a strictly consequentialist or utilitarian theory. You don't do it because they deserved it. You do it because we can get some benefit out of doing it. That's, right, the fundamental problem with utilitarian or consequentialist theories of punishment. Retributive theories of justice and punishment, on the other hand, seek to avoid this by making the wrongness of the act, and not just its harmfulness, but its wrongness, central to the justification for punishment. And really, I mean, there's part of the point, right? Utilitarians don't really have room for the distinction between a harmful act and a wrong act. The whole moral worth of an action has to do with how much harm or pain or pleasure it produced, not whether it was wrong or right. Or rather, they'll just define wrong and right in terms of pain and pleasure produced. And that is to elide a really important distinction. There are plenty of harms that are not wrongs, plenty of benefits that were not, the doing of praiseworthy actions, for example. All right, there are some issues to bear in mind throughout our discussions with the next three articles we're going to look at. Who is the proper target of punishment? And I think the relevance of this one comes up from the discussion of utilitarian theories that we've just had. I mean, for utilitarian theory, for all it matters, you should punish, and now you'd see why the scare quotes, because it isn't really a theory of punishment. It's a theory of how we can use people in order to promote the good, right? But for the utilitarian, for all that it actually matters, you can punish, again, scare quotes, right, people whether they did crimes or not. Because if you get the same consequences, if you get beneficial consequences, why not, right? Whereas for the retributivist, it's going to be only, right, only the people who have transgressed and for what reason. And for the restitution theory, it's going to be only people who have harmed other individuals, right? But it's not a matter of whether they've transgressed some rule unless it involves harming someone. Another issue to keep in mind, who exactly has been harmed? Who should count as the victim in a criminal's action? That is to say, for whom are we seeking justice by punishment? Another way of looking at that is to ask, what's the connection between the punishment and the victim? The restitution theory will say, well, the punishment has to make the victim whole. And the victim victim is whoever got their car stolen, right? The retributivist theory might say, well, it's society that's been harmed by the transgression, and it's society, right, that whose harm is to be redressed by punishment. The final question, which really doesn't very often come up, and which I think deserves much more attention. Let's suppose punishment is justified. So-and-so should be punished. That's not the same thing as saying that any particular individual or institution or society itself has the right to carry out the punishment. One thing to say so-and-so should be punished. It's another thing to say there's someone who should punish them. Okay, all of those are preliminaries. Things to keep in mind. Now let's turn to Morris himself. Here's what he's going to argue. This is sort of where we're going. He's going to argue that the right to be punished for criminal behavior follows from the right to be treated as a person. Now, right away, notice how funny that sounds. People should be punished in order to respect their rights. It's the criminal's right. So that's a really weird right that no one would ever want to assert. Right? I guess sometimes people do. I guess people turn themselves in and say, I insist that you punish me because I've been a bad boy. But by and large, criminals would prefer to evade punishment. And Morris here is going to argue that, no, it's the criminal's right to be punished. And we fail to respect them as persons unless we, in fact, punish them or forgive them, which is a slightly different matter. Right? So people have a right to be treated as persons, and Morris thinks that from that, it follows that they have a right to be punished, and that we fail to respect them as persons if we don't follow through. Moreover, this right to be treated as a person is natural, inalienable, and absolute in ways to be discussed. So all of this entails we violate a criminal's rights as a person unless we punish or forgive them for their criminal action. So that's what he's going to argue. Now, how's he going to argue it? He's going to argue it by contrasting, at least initially, two conceptions. What's going on over here? Cool. Laser show, man. It's going to argue by, but distracting. He's going to argue by contrasting two general conceptions of how society might regard behaviors that it finds unacceptable. Let's not say criminal, but just that it finds unacceptable. Okay? These two different models are the punishment model and the therapy model, or the treatment model. So, what are these two models? Let's start with the punishment model. So he's got a basic conception of society underlying his discussion of the punishment model. And I want to say right up front, not sure, I'm sorry, I'm just now seeing this comment, Christopher. The moral claim is mostly comparative. I mean, for the utilitarian, you should act so as to maximize net utility. But of course, and the act that maximizes net utility as compared with any other action is the correct thing to do. But yeah, there are other actions that might come close to doing that and other actions that might come way far from doing that. And yeah, those are better and, there's best and then there's better and worse as well for the utilitarian. Okay. There's a model of society that Morris adopts. And I think it's problematic in various ways, and it gives him a basis for understanding what's wrong with criminal conduct that I think is also problematic. But I think it's a serious question whether and to what extent his basic point about the rights entailing a right to be punished depends upon the particular model that the particular conception of the nature of organized society that he operates with. So maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but keep that in mind. So the picture he has is the basic, it's a roughly Hobbesian contractualist model of society. We are all of roughly equal power. We all have desires. And there's limited goods, so our desires often enough come into conflict in such a way that we have to compete for possession of goods. So in light of these facts, which we know, we agree, make a contract, to a system of laws that restrains our abilities to do things to satisfy our desires, on the assumption that other people agree to do the same. So such an agreement is mutually beneficial. The benefit that we get is non-interference from others, right? So long as everyone abides. But the burden is that we have to refrain from engaging in the same interferences that other people agree not to engage in. So I agree. I get the benefit of you're not stealing my stuff, each of you not stealing my stuff, but only at the cost of my agreeing, oh, guess what, I won't steal your stuff either. Okay, so mutually beneficial agreement. So criminal penalties associated with violations of these laws that we all agree to for our mutual benefit. Criminal penalties, punishment associated with violations are reasonable and just in that they provide disincentives to violations and thereby provide some assurance to those who do comply that others will comply as well. They ensure fairness by making sure that the burdens and benefits are equally shared, right? So, we penalize people for breaking the law because they haven't taken they have reneged on their agreement to suffer the burden of not stealing your stuff. If we don't punish them and we leave it standing that they can steal your stuff, then those who comply have an unfair burden relative to those who don't comply. Right? Those who don't, right? So it's like just to make sure that they make sure it's fair. And they do this by erasing the unfair advantage the criminal has gained by his violation. The criminal punishment is a mechanism whereby unfair advantage the criminal gains by reneging on their agreement to suffer the burden of non-interference with others, right? Where that unfair advantage is in some way erased. The criminal has taken something that is not rightly his and owes this what he's taken back to the society from which he has taken it. Punishment in this sense exacts his debt. So I take something that's not fairly mine because everyone else has agreed to not steal, but I stole, so I get the benefit of the protection of your agreement not to steal, but I don't suffer the burden of it. That's not fair. I got an advantage. I have to pay it back. Now, I'll get you in a second, Tim. This, to me, seems very obscure in the following way. Punishment may perhaps eliminate the benefit the criminal has gained by his crime. And in that sense, restore some abstract equilibrium. At least the criminal hasn't profited by his crime, right? But it doesn't in any obvious way restore the victim to the position the victim would have been in had the violation not occurred. At least if you think of the victim as the person whose car was stolen or the person who was assaulted, right? So the difficulty here is to see how exactly retribution in the form of punishment of the criminal serves the ends of restitution. Because restitution, that's a matter of paying your debts. And right here, Morris is saying that punishment of a form that looks retributive somehow on its own serves the function of repayment of debt, which is restitution. And it's just not at all clear to me how punishment without making the victim whole can be understood as a form of payment of debt. Unless, of course, the idea is that the debt isn't to the person whose car was stolen, but to society. And even then, it's not clear how society as a whole has a debt paid back to it just because someone who violated a rule suffers a harm. That's just not clear to me. And I think it's a point of deep obscurity, and it's not unrelated to what's wrong with this analysis of what's wrong with criminal behavior, why rule breaking is wrong. His model is it's wrong because you're essentially a free rider. It is the criminal behavior violating rules that other people agree to abide by. What's wrong with that is that you're a free rider. That is to say, you're accepting a benefit without accepting the corresponding burden. That's his fundamental analysis. We'll read Jean Hampton next time. She's going to find that to be a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about what's wrong with criminal behavior. I agree with her. I think that's just not what's wrong. And if you start out with a wrong idea of what's wrong with criminal behavior, then you're probably going to come up with a misguided justification for punishing it. And I think that's what, in part, what goes on here. Okay. Another way you can exact the transgressor's debt is by forgiveness. If I forgive your debt, you no longer owe me. Okay? So that extinguishes the debt. That's another legitimate way to get out of a situation in which one person owes somebody something else. You can either make them pay it or this person can forgive the debt. Those are both ways of eliminating that that disequilibrium caused by the free riding. Sam, you were going to...
Yeah. Does the justification that criminal penalties might disincentivize violations, is that a possible problem on the model that it's like returning to area justifications, making use of them when it's trying to treat you?
Well,
Because It sounds
So-
a lot like the utilitarian.
Yeah.
Disincentive.
But he says, right, the disincentive, so I just wrote this part in the slide, but the reason that the disincentive is, disincentivizing violations is reasonable and just is that it provides people assurance, provides those who comply with assurance that other people will do the same. So it's not keeping them from causing harms and thereby providing the benefit of keeping them from causing harms. It's reinforcing the integrity of the agreement. That is the foundation of the social order, according to him. Okay. I don't have time to go through the next slide today, so I'll do it next time and read Gene Hampton as well. And keep those cards and letters coming. And thanks for your time. And have a nice rest of your day. I hate that expression so much. Just have a nice day. Like people say, have a nice rest of your day, as though you're saying that. Right? It's like, why should I tell you to have a nice day when I have no control over the part of your day that already happened? Right? So it's only the rest of your day I'm concerned about, as though my saying, have a nice rest of your day, is going to like potentially matter to how nice the rest of your day is. You know, it's weird. Have a nice day.
We'll never say that.
Well, don't say it to me.
I've heard enjoy the rest of your day, but not have a nice rest of your day.
Yeah, and the rest of your day as like an
It's like
entity.
enjoy the rest of your day, have a nice day, goodbye.
How about rest
Yeah.
of your week?
Yeah, or
Yeah,
like,
rest of
what's
your
special about this day, right? Have a nice next 37 and a half hours. Okay?
Arbitrary.
But at the
Have a
end of
good
that-
one, you pick the unit.